This is our second ILS event for the semester. I would like to welcome all of you. This is our annual alumni event that we put together just to reconnect with some ILAW alums, see where they have gone after SAIS, what are certain things they did, so that those of us who are graduating this summer can get some really good advice and real life experience. We can hear about their experiences and learn from it and that will hopefully help us decide what we want to do next. Today we have Professor Schneebaum is our moderator who will be guiding us through the event. We've got alums from 2002, 2006, and 2018. So we have a big range of alums, lawyers, non-lawyers. It's going to be really interesting. I will now let Professor Schneebaum introduce our panelists, and then we will go from there.
Well, thank you, Akanksha, and good morning, everyone. This is an event, as Akanksha said, that we have attempted to organize annually, both to reconnect with alumni and also to give alumni something of a state of the program context. And so before I introduce the panelists, I'm just going to spend 2 or 3 minutes telling you where we stand as the International Law Program at SAIS. We are doing very well, even in the face of the constraints that COVID-19 has imposed on us. We are very happy to say that this year we are hosting 31 ILAW concentrators, 14 first years and 17 second years who will be receiving their master's degrees in international relations in May. We have 2 minors. We have 1 MIPP, 1 Doctor of International Affairs who's just begun her study, and 1 DIA who will be the first DIA laureate to graduate from the International Law Program later this spring, Min Chang, and we're very proud of her. So that's where we stand with respect to students. With respect to courses and faculty, things have really not changed very much in the last several years. We have an active agenda of courses here in Washington, including environmental law, constitutional law, introduction to international law, business and human rights, international investment law, crises in international law, and of course in the United Nations system. In Bologna, we have courses in women, multiculturalism and the rights of women, international human rights law, international trade law, constitutional law, and the introductory course as well. So we have an active and vibrant program, which we are hoping to continue into the new curricular regime that will begin in the next academic year. Most of you, I trust, will know about this, but there will be no more programs as such. The school is moving toward a more cross-disciplinary approach, and so there will be no programs, and therefore there will be no program director like me. But there will, we hope, in the fall be a new Burling professor. You will know, I trust, that the Burling Chair in International Law Organizations was endowed by the family of Edward Burling in the 1970s. Edward Burling, who was a colleague and friend of Paul Nitze and Christian Herder, the founders of SAIS. And the Burling Chair was occupied first by Stephen Schwebel, who went on from SAIS to greater things, even if you can imagine, became a judge on the International Court of Justice and ultimately the president of that court. Following Steve Schwebel, Christoph Schroer held the chair before he was appointed professor of international law at the University of Vienna. And most recently, a friend of many of you, Ruth Wedgwood, was the incumbent of the Burling Chair until most recently, about a year and a half ago now. So the program is alive and well, thriving, we hope increasing, growing. With the new Burling professor, we hope that the course offerings will be expanded even further next year, and we will draw not only more ILAW students, ILAW concentrators, but more students from the broader SAIS community who want at least a basic grounding in international law. I can tell you that with respect to the Burling professorship, the search committee on which I serve has narrowed the field down to 4 finalists. We are, as I speak, we are right in the middle of the virtual campus visits that the 4 finalists are undertaking. We've had 2 of them. We have a third one today and a final one next Tuesday. We're hoping that the committee will be able to make its recommendation to the SAIS Academic Council next week. And therefore, we are hoping that by the end of next week or the beginning of the following week, we will be able to announce the name of the new Burling Professor of International Law at Johns Hopkins. So that's the state of play. That's the state of the program in a nutshell. And so now let's turn to the main event, which is the panel that we have brought together today with the very clever, creative, and thank you, Akanksha, title SAIS of Life. Cute, huh? Very cute. An international law perspective. And we have 4 alumni who will be talking with us. They, the senior most of them, got his MA from SAIS in 2002 and the most recent in 2017. So spanning a great deal of SAIS history. And the point here is to see what happens to SAIS ILAW concentrators after they graduate. After all, obviously, this is not a law school, and I hope that's not news to anyone who's listening. This is not a law school, and so some ILAW graduates do go on to become lawyers. One of our 4 today is a lawyer. One is on his way to becoming one, but there are many, many other career tracks that SAIS ILAW alumni follow. And what we're most interested in hearing about today is how did the experience at SAIS draw you in the first place? And then how did it influence your subsequent career path? And that we hope will be inspiring, informational to our current students who are listening. And we hope that it will be able to provoke something of an expression of interest from them. Ground rules, because this is being hosted in webinar format and not in meeting format, the only way that you can pose questions is through the Q&A box, but please don't be shy. Post those questions as they come to your mind. I will curate them after the 4 introductory presentations. I have some questions of my own that were fed to me by the International Law Society. Again, thank you, Akanksha. And I will put some of those questions, but we certainly want to engage the questions that current students have, because that's the main purpose of this event, to show them that there is indeed life after SAIS. So without further ado, the 4 panelists whom I have the great pleasure to introduce will begin with David Vannier, who is a graduate, Master of Arts graduate in the year 2002. David went on to a career in the International Monetary Fund and currently heads his own consulting firm. And I'm very happy to say, David was a participant in the Jessup International Law Moot Court in 2002, my class. So, David, it's great to see you again. Please take it away.
Thank you very much. So I, you know, to answer your first question, I think would draw me to SAIS and then law, the IL concentration in particular. My background quickly is I was raised between Europe and the U.S. Did my undergrad studies in Poughkeepsie, New York at Vassar College. And after that, I went to work for the French Prime Minister for a year, and then was hired by Business Week to work out of their Paris hub, which covered Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. And you know, I was incredibly interested in anything pertaining to international relations, and in that field, of course, you know, there aren't that many programs that are worth the time, if one would say, but clearly SAIS was a standout. And one of the things that attracted me to SAIS in particular was the concentration in economics. Now, this is a bit, you know, a bit contradictory in that I don't actually enjoy economics, which is even more contradictory after 14 years at the IMF, but it was fundamental, you know, and I still believe it is, that in order to really understand international relations, one has to have a strong grasp of economics. And, you know, the counterweight to that was the fun and intellectual satisfaction that was brought about by international law. Now, I should be perfectly honest, I initially started in the strategy field, which had been my field of study, my course of study in undergrad. And so, as you know, Professor Schneebaum mentioned, I graduated in 2002, so this is, you know, almost a century ago. But back then, terrorism was a field that was very much understudied. And this is what I was concentrating in. Of course, 9/11 changed everything. And that everyone and their mother became an expert in terrorism. And intellectually, there was very little satisfaction drawn from it. I mean, once we exclude, of course, the human element. And that to me, made international law the absolute perfect fit because it had a bunch of components that were fundamental. And I'll get into this in a second, but while I've never done anything per se professionally with my concentration in law, I think in many ways it's been the backbone of everything I've done since. And what I mean by that is, and Professor Schneebaum and I think Lawrence will be able to talk about this much better than I, but of course, a law degree allows you to frame things in a very logical way, to be an adequate wordsmith, and all these other elements, which regardless of what field one goes in, are fundamental, I believe, for success. I mean, one says that life is about packaging, and I think certainly it's true. And so to me, law in many ways has been kind of a guiding light, if one would, and the backbone around which I built the rest. Now, after SAIS, I went to work for the Financial Times, coming back to the importance of writing. And then from the Financial Times, I was hired to work in what was then the largest trading room in the world, which was a French bank based in New York called the Crédit Lyonnais. I think, frankly, after a year of helping very wealthy people become even wealthier, I kind of thought that, perhaps I could do something else. And so I went to work on community-driven development in Africa, basically empowering small communities to decide what road they wanted to espouse in their development needs. And this was fascinating in the context of the bank. I then went to work in Cambodia for a little while for the World Bank, and then I taught there at university. And eventually, I turned back to the field of economics as a developmental economist, and then was hired by the IMF. And in the frame of the IMF, what I did is perhaps atypical, is that I spent about 12 and a half years serving 3 successive managing directors. So outside of the strict field daily work of the institution, but much more kind of, in the helicopter vision, if one would, hovering at the top and looking at all of it. It was incredible, but to reiterate what I was saying earlier, I think none of this, and I'm not saying this because Professor Schneebaum is staring at me on that huge screen in front of me, but because I think fundamentally it gave me a few things. Again, it gave me the backbone around which I built everything, which was in terms of writing, in terms of creating, crafting arguments and the rest. But I think also because, in the field of international organizations, there are many different principles, many different ways of doing things. And in some way, a legal background was an anchor that reminded me of the values that were dear to me. And I think, through all these experiences in the last 19 years, which is way more than I thought it would be, but I cannot, tell you enough how fundamental and how helpful what I did in the context of the international law degree was for me in every step of my career. And that's all I have for my recent history.
Good. Well, thank you, David. Thank you very much. And you've given me a lot of fodder for questions, and I hope you've done the same for our audience. Let me introduce next Lawrence Caplan, who is a lawyer, and indeed was a lawyer before he came to SAIS. So that obviously raises the question, why in the world would someone already licensed to practice law, or at least eligible to obtain a license to practice law, want to come to a school that does not focus specifically on legal training? So Lawrence, take it away. Tell us about that. But you have to unmute yourself first. There you go.
Please don't hold the fact that I'm a lawyer against me.
To the contrary, I'd be the last person on earth to do that.
My SAIS of Life story begins on 9/11, the 9/11. I was at my law office, minding my own business, trying to stay out of trouble, and the reports started to come in. And when, I guess, the plane hit the second tower, I decided it was time to close up shop and go home. And I went home, I turned on the TV, and it was on CBS, and Dan Rather was on with a gentleman, an older gentleman who I didn't recognize, I'd never seen before. And Dan Rather asked him if at this early stage he had any idea as far as, who might be behind this. And this gentleman said, well, Dan, not to be too blunt, but this is an Osama bin Laden operation. It has Al-Qaeda's fingerprints all over it. And I'm quite sure that is what's going. And I was like, who the hell is this guy that I don't know? And when they came back from a break, Dan Rather introduced him. He said, this is Professor Fouad Ajami. He's the director of Middle Eastern Affairs at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Affairs. And from that point on, being the inquisitive person I am, I had to learn what this was. And it was interesting because many years ago, when I got out of law school and I decided I didn't want to practice law, I went to work up at Fort Meade. I can say the initials NSA. And I spent a lot of time in Washington, but I never knew anything about SAIS. And anyways, so long story short, a few years later, I had reached the point where I was ready to make a change. I was, I guess, having my midlife crisis, and I applied to SAIS, not thinking that I would ever get in. Lo and behold, I get an envelope saying you've been admitted to the class in 2006, and I went up to the orientation. I had a friend who was living in DC, and put me up for a couple of days, and I sat in on a class taught by Professor Bodnar, and it was like a very intensive, I don't remember the name of it, but it was a very intensive economics class, and my eyes started to glaze over. And I was like, what have I gotten myself into? I was very good in math like 100 years ago, but am I going to be able to handle this? And I met people there. I met a gentleman who was even older than me who had come back. He was the chairman of a very big materials firm in Texas, and now he funds the Center for Central European Studies. But anyhow, I decided, oh, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give this a shot. I was in between marriages. I didn't have kids. It was an opportunity for me to do it, and I ended up starting in the winter of 2006, and I decided that I had to finish by the end of the summer in order to be able to continue my law practice, which I was operating long distance. I had one other associate, but for the most part it was me, and I ended up taking 5 classes in a language and smushing them all into Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, so that on Monday and Tuesday I would have free if I needed to fly back to Florida to meet with clients. And I remember I took a class. I want to mention this because it was one of those things where I just took the class because it fit into the time schedule, and it was taught by Professor Karaj. I don't know if he still teaches there or not. He mainly teaches at Indiana, but it was a course in American studies. It basically was an overview of all the secretaries of state from the beginning of the 20th century to present, including Kissinger and Atchison and so forth. It was absolutely fascinating. I just couldn't wait to come to that class on Friday afternoon, and I would even put off the happy hour in order to make that class. So I took those classes. I went through the summer. I took a class, I should say, with Professor Wyss in international investment law, and that I mentioned because we stayed in touch over the years, and now I'm of counsel to her new Washington firm with partners. So there alone, SAIS really panned out for me. But I mentioned the fact that I did the program in like 21 weeks because I think in retrospect, it was a very close call whether I was going to go back to Florida or whether I was going to stay in Washington. And I was looking at morphing from being a lawyer to going into journalism with a legal and international affairs bent. And I think had I put my feet in cement and stayed, I probably, you know, would be bloviating on one of the cable networks these days. But I ended up, for various reasons, trucking back to Florida. And I remember very vividly trying to put it off, finding excuses. I hadn't seen Frederick Douglass's house in Anacostia yet, so I've got to go see that, and I've got to go to this place and that place. And finally, I ran out of excuses, and my clients were screaming at me that they needed this done and that done, and I hightailed it back to Florida. And I was already an attorney, but now, even more so, I handled international matters, and I started a company called the Sequoia Group doing offshore asset protection trusts and corporations and LLCs for generally wealthy individuals, professionals who had a lot of risk of a creditor attack. So I formed that company, and as I said, I did more international work, but I was just practicing law. And to be perfectly honest, there have been times when I have said to myself, especially when I'm, watching cable news and watching what's going on up there and so forth, that, oh, I wish I were up there. I wish I were, in the mix. And practicing law has been it's been financial. How about now?
That's good.
You hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So anyways, I've had, there have been times when I had second thoughts. Now I'm married and I have 2 kids, and, I'm very content and so forth. And now, because I'm of counsel to Professor Wiss's firm, I'm becoming more and more involved. And once this pandemic finally resolves itself, I plan to spend more and more time in Washington. Now, the last thing I should note is that over the past few months, and I don't remember how this started, but I got the idea to do a podcast. And I had seen online that Pandora, which had been housing like music, that it had decided, it had entered into a joint venture with SiriusXM and was going to be sponsoring podcasts. And I started my own podcast called The American Question. And that got picked up by Pandora and we've now done 6 or 7 shows. And it's really starting to generate a lot of activity, and very excited about that. And we've had Professor Wiss as a guest, and I'm hoping to have more guests from SAIS on the show in the near future. And so in that podcast basically is focused on international affairs and, all the events that took place over the last few months. And I promise, I'll just close by promising that I am not making a pilgrimage to Mar-a-Lago anytime soon. I give you my word on that.
Okay.
Even though I'm only about a half an hour away.
Okay.
And I have met the former gentleman many times. That's another story for another day.
As the current president referred to him, the former guy.
The former guy.
Okay. Thank you very much, Lawrence. Our next alumna is Mary Kalemkerian, who is a human rights officer with the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in New York. That, I dare say, is a career that many in this audience will envy, and I hope you can tell us things that will increase that sense of envy. Mary graduated with a Master of Arts degree in the class of 2006. Mary?
Thanks, Professor Schneebaum, and thanks, Akansha and the International Law Society for inviting me to talk to you today about my career. Indeed, I work for the United Nations, which is kind of, for me, was the cherry on top of the field of study of international law. I graduated in 2006 from SAIS with a dual concentration in international law and organizations and conflict management, and I guess a triple concentration if you count international economics, but I always try to spend as little time on that as possible, although it was ironically the thing that drew me to SAIS. Irony. So I did 1 year in Bologna and 1 year in Washington, D.C. And unlike previous alum, I am not a lawyer, but what I often say in my day job is that I'm not a lawyer, but I play one on TV as much as any of my career is on TV, which it is not. So among those concentrations, I would say that my UN career has spanned all three elements of that. First kind of conflict management, where I was working in human rights, but in a ceasefire zone where the UN was supporting the implementation of a peace agreement. And then my later positions were, I guess, very, very strictly international law, monitoring arbitrary arrest, detention, and torture in firsthand in police state, carrying out human rights reporting and engaging with UN special procedures mechanisms of the Human Rights Council. And now I would say my career is mostly on the international organization side. While still working in human rights for the UN, I'm much more involved in the functioning of the organization and the, let's say, the structural upholding of the world order than directly on human rights myself. So how I got here, I finished my my bachelor's degree in the liberal arts in the late 90s, and that was a time of the 90s were a time of explosion of UN what we were calling humanitarian intervention at the time, which is really UN peacekeeping. And in the late 90s, there was the intervention in Kosovo. Then, of course, as the two alums before me mentioned, 9/11 happened, and we had the US invasion of Afghanistan. And then, of course, the much studied case of the war in Iraq that was not authorized by the UN Security Council. And these were all things that interested me, and this took place before I studied SAIS and before I studied international law, but it is kind of what drew me to international law and to studying human rights as an academic discipline. Then in the years leading up to that, and during my studies in international law at SAIS, which took place during the Bush administration, we had not just the intervention, the illegal intervention in Iraq, but we had the opening of Guantanamo Bay, the arbitrary detention of X number of foreign nationals there, and we also had the US policy on extraordinary renditions, which were all things that, of course, I think as a news consumer, you hear and you wonder, how does this compute? Because isn't there a world order that should prevent things like this from happening? And so this is what drew me to study international law. As I said, I did 1 year in Bologna, so it was there that I was able to take introduction to international law, and I think that the offering was pretty limited in international law at that time, so I think that's all I did in Bologna. And then in DC, I was able to focus more on areas of international humanitarian law, human rights law, and the UN as an international organization and its functioning with, as Professor Schneebaum mentioned, under Ruth Wedgwood, of course. So then after SAIS, I started looking for a job. And, as I said, I was, a dual concentrator in conflict management. And what I was really drawn to was, the nexus between conflict and international law, trying to work to address some of the most egregious human rights violations, which tend to take place in situations of armed conflict. So I wanted to go where the action was. I was in my, I think, late 20s, or let's just say that. And I wanted to find, you know, a place where I could get field experience and really experience firsthand the things that I'd learned about in books, and the structures that, you know, test international law at its core. So I started looking to the United Nations, because what better organization to be involved around the world than the United Nations? And as a US citizen among international organizations, I was drawn to that over, let's say, other organizations that have similar types of field operations like the OSCE. Of course, the UN, as many know, if you've ever tried applying for a job, or maybe you've spent a career trying to apply for a job, it's a bit of a fortress. Like many organizations, I won't say it's unique to the UN. But, you know, as a recent graduate, you know, I was looking at at that time, the online platform was called Galaxy. It's now been replaced by something called Inspira. The UN loves these kind of atmospheric names for things. So, you know, and I was applying, you know, I'd see these jobs, they were P2, P3, P4, and it says, you need 5 years of experience in this. And I'd say, oh, I have 10 years of experience, I'm qualified. But no, not in the eyes of the UN. So it was very hard to break into the UN. And eventually I found an opportunity, which was, in fact, it was a SAIS MIPP who had already had a previous career in the UN, who told me, why don't you look into the UN Volunteers Program? So that's what I did. And the UN Volunteers Program is a program that works, it's a UN entity, works alongside and within the UN, but is administered separately. And so the volunteers are not considered UN staff, although they perform all the functions of staff. So this took me to Sudan. At that time, it was following the comprehensive peace agreement that ended 20 years of civil war between the South and the North. And I got to be a human rights officer in a peacekeeping operation in what would now be southeastern Sudan. Engaging with communities, affected communities, you know, anything between arbitrary arrest and, you know, there was a lot of economic development and flooding and forced displacement of communities by government policies. So it was really amazing getting to work firsthand and trying to, you know, you collect this information and then you file reports and you say, aha, this is the international legal framework and these are the rights that have been violated. And from there, then I went to another position also in Sudan, but there was a very focused one, working in Khartoum, working on cases of arbitrary arrest, detention, and torture. And it was there that I got to engage, because of the scope of the cases and the pattern of abuses, got to engage more clearly with the international human rights system by submitting or supporting the submission of cases to UN special procedures, working group on arbitrary detention, working group on enforced and involuntary disappearances, etc., working with the special rapporteur on Sudan. And that was when I really got like a flavor for what the UN human rights framework is, and how the rights of one individual in Sudan can be brought before the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And it's really amazing to see. I mean, you could argue that what the effects of it are minimal, but you know, to give voice to violations against individuals, you know, people who may not even have an internet connection, and then their case is brought before the Human Rights Council. It's really amazing. And I've been talking quite a bit, so I'll go quickly on the rest. For the last 8 years, I've been working, still human rights officer, still with the UN and still in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, but working a bit more on planning of our field operations. So it's a lot more on the institution of the UN and less on human rights. that being said, I'm in direct contact with my human rights colleagues on the ground on a daily basis in 12 UN peacekeeping operations. And it's my role to take some of their concerns, how they're able to do their job, and then bring it back to the UN system and bring it back to the membership of the organization and say, you know what, this is the situation on the ground. And you've said, this is the mandate. You've said, these are the resources we have. And I can tell you that that's not adding up. So in my current functions, I engage a lot within the organization with other departments and, dare I say, silos of the organization, as well as directly with the membership of the organization of 193 member states, sometimes advocating on our behalf and sometimes lobbying for greater resources and attention to human rights in these country situations. So I think I've rambled a bit, but I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer more questions.
Well, that was terrific, Mary, and I think you did exactly what I hoped you would do, which is to say, I suspect there will be a lot of listeners who are thinking, I want to be Mary when I grow up. So we'll see shortly. The most recent of our four alumni to graduate from SAIS is Qifan Huang, who was a Jessup participant in 2017, 15 years after David Vannier. Hard to imagine. And Qifan's team did exceptionally well in the Jessup competition. Qifan then left SAIS to go to Columbia Law School, no mean feat that, where he is now a 3L, looking forward to a career, I take it, which perhaps he'll tell us all about. So Qifan, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. And it's great to be here with you and all the other distinguished alumni. And happy to offer my more recent perspective on how I got to where I am. So I was born in China, and I was an international relations undergrad, during which I interned at the UN Resident Coordinator's Office in Beijing, which was what brought me to SAIS, because SAIS just seemed to me like a natural destination for someone like me who's interested both in international organizations and law, as well as resolving conflicts. So I was an international law major as well as a conflict management major at SAIS. And during my time there, as Stephen has already mentioned, I participated at the Jessup International Moot Court and took a bunch of international law classes with Stephen, which really opened my eyes to another perspective of what could have been, what would be a very interesting career. It really helped me, especially Jessup, really helped me to think about what I really want to do in the future and how to use my oral advocacy skills in my future career, which was when I decided, after a consultation with Stephen, of course, to pursue a law school career. So before that, I worked for a year at the International Law Institute down in DC, where I designed training programs for foreign officials and judges, issues of international law and American law. So my work basically constituted reaching out to American law firms and government organizations in the US to ask them to speak to these foreign judges and officials and talk about issues of, say, international trade, international investment law, CFIUS review, and all the others. After my year there, I went to Columbia Law School here in New York, during which I served on the board of the Columbia Society of International Law, as well as the Society of Law, Science, and Technology. I just finished my year at the Journal of Transnational Law as an articles editor. And I'm currently having an internship at the Second Circuit and has previously completed one at the Southern District of New York. I interned at the Electronic Frontiers Foundation during my first year's summer, and I will be joining a law firm, Wilson Sonsini, Goodrich & Rosati, in Palo Alto, California, after this May, to work on internet law that includes copyright-related issues, content moderation, such as Section 230 and the First Amendment, as well as privacy issues. And I would say that my education at SAIS really helped me to realize what other possibilities that I have. And I think it also provides me with a very unique policy perspective that I think a lot of lawyers would benefit from. You are not only thinking when you're analyzing legal problems, not only thinking about what would the law be and what would you, it also provides me with a perspective of what I want the law to be like from a policy perspective, which allows me, in my personal opinion, to give a more effective advocacy based on policy and legal rationales. And I really do feel that this unique perspective has helped me, and I hope that it will further help me in my future career.
Good. Thank you, Qifan. Now, I have some set questions that the ILS has given me, but I'm really much more interested in hearing questions from the audience. We have one so far, but I hope there'll be lots more. Let me put this one and see where we go from there. This is a question from a first-year ILAW concentrator currently at SAIS, and it's directed to David Vannier, but I suspect that there may be others who will want to chime in on it. Jack Klein asks, since you had a rather varied set of professional experiences shortly after your time at SAIS, I wanted to ask what some of the key objectives and skills you got out of those early experiences and what you looked for in the roles that you undertook subsequently. David?
So it's great. It's an easy question to start with, right?
Well, they always are.
Look, so I have to be, really honest. My dream job was to be a journalist. So when I left SAIS, I went back into my dream job. But I think, frankly, by 2002, the economic model for journalism was showing already early stress signs that it perhaps wasn't all that much viable. And I, at that point had massive amounts of school debts to pay off. So this was a consideration. But the other thing, perhaps, I think, and perhaps more importantly, in a way, I thought I had reached a ceiling in journalism, which was, I was what, 25, 26 years old, which I thought made me very old and very wise, but I think in the eyes of the world, that made me just a kid. And so, it became readily apparent that I needed more, I think, world experience in order to have any gravitas in commenting anything, but also to better understand all these linkages and all these nexuses. And so I think, at that point, I kind of purposefully decided I would step outside of my comfort zone. I needed to learn more. And I think by going outside of the comfort zone, first of all, I naturally, I went towards things I naturally would not go towards, which allowed me to learn a whole lot more about, a ton of things I was blissfully unaware of. But perhaps in that immediate context, and at least more importantly to me, was a lot more about myself. So I can't, I mean, the key takeaways in a way were that I had to shake that tree of knowledge that I had, right, which was pretty young, and add a whole lot more to it. And I think at some point, one should never underestimate the strength, the strength of serendipity, is because one thing led to another, and by that what I mean is when I got to the IMF after about a year. Dominique Strauss-Kahn was elected to head the institution, and he needed someone who was perfectly bilingual and bicultural in French and in English, which was me. And so, one thing led to another. But I think, I think that the takeaway I had and the skills I wanted to learn were in a way much more personal, much more about myself, what I was capable of, confronting how little I knew and how much more I needed to learn. And so I think always putting myself outside of my comfort zone was a very useful element. I would caution one thing. I think at one point it is very pleasant to step back inside one's comfort zone. So I waited 20 years to do that. There may be value in waiting less time.
Very good, thank you. Any other comments on that question or on David's answer? We are beginning to get some additional questions, so no particular pressure to take on that one. All right, well, hearing none. The next question is directed to Mary, and it's the one that I had expected. So, and I hope, Mary, that you have expected it too. And it basically is, comes from a second-year ILAW concentrator. It basically is, if I want to enter the human rights space, where's the door? Where do I come in? Or as he put it, what advice would you give to somebody trying to break into human rights as a career? And particularly, he asks, is field work a necessity? And are there specific organizations that SAIS graduates should be thinking of as potential career venues?
Thanks for the question. I think, you know, human rights is it's a tough field. I managed to get in with Masters of Arts in International Relations. I think a lot of people get in through with either an LLM. I mean, I think an LLM is the most common other way in, but then you do have a number of human rights lawyers who are accredited lawyers in their own country and then can apply national legal knowledge to the international framework. So, I mean, I'm of course biased. I think the United Nations, the United Nations is not just, I think, most active in human rights, but it's the guardian of the international human rights legal framework. So it has that advantage of having both an operations arm and then having a normative arm as well. You know, I think there are other, I would ask you what it is in human rights that you want to do. You know, there are great non-governmental organizations that do some research and a lot of advocacy, such as, I would say, Human Rights Watch, stronger on the advocacy side, and Amnesty International, stronger on the research side. Both do both, but you know, which I think are really good at raising public awareness and globally of human rights issues. And then there's also, you know, the UN side, where you have institutional solutions or avenues, maybe not always solutions, but institutional avenues for addressing human rights concerns. I think fieldwork is a great way to experience human rights firsthand. I think, you know, it's one thing to, you know, read ICCPR and know all the rights that are guaranteed. If you're coming from a country that has a strong legal rights framework, like using the United States for an example, I mean, there's lots of gaps in the implementation, but, you know, we have a constitution that safeguards these rights. So you read the ICCPR and you're like, oh, why do we need that really, right? But then, you know, looking at, you know, entering countries where you realize that there are none of these guarantees, and then you realize the importance of the international legal framework that perhaps from a more cushy location or background you don't see. So I think experiencing that firsthand confers greater value on the international human rights framework. And if that's something you're looking for, then I would say, yes, go to the field.
You know, Mary, listening to you reminds me that I did a trial observation in Africa, West Africa, in the late 1980s. And we were attending a trial of 3 men who were accused of treason in a failed coup attempt. And it was quite obvious that if they were convicted, they would be executed. And there was a fairly large profile of the case that drew a number of international observers. And the first night that we were there, a group of dissidents who were supportive of the defendants organized a reception, a cocktail party for the international visitors. Very lovely event. You know, there was good food, drink. We were all milling around, shaking hands and getting to know each other. When someone clinked a glass, one of the hosts clinked a glass and said, you know, we want to welcome our international guests and so on and so on. But just want to point something out to you. You have mingled around this room. You have met Supreme Court justices. You have met leading figures in the bar, defense counsel, prosecutors. You've met people who are active in government ministries. What we want you to take away from this is that every single legal professional in this room has, within the last 10 years, spent time in prison. Yeah, there's a big gap between what the ICCPR says, or what the US Constitution says, and what really happens out there in the world. So thank you for reminding us of that. The next question is addressed to...
could I just add one quick thing?
Please.
Just one quick thing on what you're saying, and I'm sorry, it's not linked directly to the field of human rights, but in terms of field work and expanding it a tiny bit, I think if someone is interested in a career in the World Bank or in regional development banks, or even to some extent the IMF or other such organizations, I think field work is, I don't want to say necessity, but is certainly incredibly useful, highly recommended, and a necessary step for any career to progress, you know, in an upwards trajectory. So I think there's a lot of value in field work. And sorry, this is a bit of a greater point than what you were saying both, but I think in general, the value of field work is fundamental. And of course, you know, to a crowd like SAIS students, this is obvious. But again, the intrinsic value of knowing different languages, of knowing different cultures, is absolutely fundamental for a happy career within the field of international organizations.
Good, thank you, David. And that is obviously a point worth stressing. And it's an area where your SAIS graduates often have a big advantage over the competition in applying for jobs. In the same way, incidentally, that we have, I always say, an advantage in the Jessup competition, because although our students aren't law students, and therefore, you know, they need some training in how to read an opinion, how to write a brief, that sort of thing, but they bring to the table an internationalism, an internationalist approach that it far exceeds their competition from Georgetown or from University of Virginia. No disrespect to those institutions intended, obviously, but you know, there is a huge value simply to the internationalist flavor of a SAIS education. Now, the next question is a more specific, a more detailed one, and it's addressed to Lawrence and to Qifan, lawyer in training. And it's a very specific question, is what either courses or key experiences do you remember from your time at SAIS that have been most beneficial to your careers so far in the law? Lawrence, you want to go first?
Okay, this is a battle to go back that far in time and remember, but I took a class in international investment law with Professor Wisp, and I knew nothing about bilateral treaties and you know, international finance and so forth. And I remember after that class, I was completely obsessed with working for either the Millennium Challenge Corporation or it's not called the OPIC anymore, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. It's now called something else. But anyhow, that class was very, it opened my eyes to a lot of things. I also took a class just because it fit into my wacky schedule in Islamic law with Professor Matar. And that was a fascinating class that I really learned a lot. I had practiced for quite a while before I came to SAIS, so I pretty much knew, you know, how practicing law worked and bringing in clients and getting paid and so forth. But doing the SAIS experience, even though I didn't, to be honest, I didn't leverage it completely that I could have. And you know, there's still time. And my podcast, I believe, you know, I market that heavily that I'm a SAIS grad. I think that, you know, it depends a lot on what kind of law you want to go into. But assuming you want to go into international law, international investment law, international trade law are very good classes. to take. And then if you have a particular geographic expertise, if you speak a foreign language, to take one of the classes that not necessarily in the legal department, but one of the overview classes regarding South America or Africa or whatever, and learn as much as you possibly can about the area. That will help you immeasurably.
Thanks, Lawrence. Qifan?
Yeah, so obviously the most helpful class that I took at SAIS would be JESA. It really helped me, first of all, find my passion in law and in general, but also really helped me give my first experience of firsthand writing for an advocate for a problem and also presenting it orally. So I think that experience was really fascinating to me, and you see that repeated again and again in law school. Most law schools, I think, require students do some sort of moot court these days before they graduate. So that is certainly something that would help you a lot. And if you decide to practice litigation after you graduate from a law school, like what I'm going to do, then all these moot court experiences, the more the better. And obviously, the other class, the U.S. Constitutional Law and International System, which was also taught by Stephen, really helped me to prepare me for what law schools look like. Obviously, the class was taught in a somewhat different way than what a traditional law school would teach it. But I would say it gives you a sneak peek of what law school classes would be like and what law professors and lawyers' way of thinking would be and what they're looking for in all of your answers and your exams. So that would definitely be something that would be helpful. I still fondly remember the ATS whenever I managed to encounter that statute, the alien tort statute in a constitutional law in federal courts. And it's just a very interesting subject overall. But I would also like to add that SAIS is a very unique experience. So you should definitely look to take classes that interest you, that broadens your horizon. What sets people different from SAIS is that they get to take a lot of interesting classes that you would never, ever have the opportunity to encounter in law school. Like I still fondly remember the behavioral sociology of conflict class that was taught by a professor at Alston. I don't know if it's still at SAIS, but that was one of the most memorable classes, and according to him, one of the most useless classes you could take at SAIS. So definitely utilize that experience and explore some things that you might never learn. I think that even though they might not be immediately useful, the ways of thinking that they provide you would be very helpful to you sometime down the future.
Well, Qifan, that was a great answer. And the question actually came from a first-year student who I believe is seriously contemplating the possibility of law school after SAIS. So I hope that answer will be particularly useful to him. And the next question comes back to Mary and comes back to the question of field work. And this question asks about the impact of the pandemic on the prospects of field work. What happens to the idea that, as you pointed out very eloquently a moment ago, that it really is a basic building block of a human rights career to be out there experiencing, seeing, talking to people who are not privileged as we are. That's the whole point. But if you can't do that in the midst of the pandemic, what happens? And also, corollary to that, there are some folks who, including the questioner, who would be just as happy to be playing the support role, playing the administrative role in a human rights context, not necessarily to be the point of the spear, but perhaps to be the hand on the spear. What advice would you give to someone perhaps less interested in field work and more interested in administration?
Thanks again for the question. So fieldwork, I guess there's two sides to fieldwork. One, we have field operations within the UN. We have 600 staff in 12 UN peacekeeping operations. 600 UN human rights staff in 12 peacekeeping operations. We also have, I'm gonna guess, like 800 staff in another 30 country offices around the world. and these are fixed positions, so fixed locations. So this work is ongoing. And the nature of the work has changed by the pandemic. There's a lot of colleagues were basically grounded in the countries where they were working without options for rest and recuperation due to travel restrictions. There may be travel restrictions in the countries where they're working so that they don't have freedom of movement. And then the violations that they're encountering may be quite different. You see a lot more violations of, in the domain of right to health and discrimination along whether ethnic or religious minority lines, because the pandemic has exposed a lot of inequalities. But we have our fieldwork positions are still in the field. That has not changed. And unfortunately, the conflicts or the dire human rights situations in which we work have not changed. Now then there's field work for someone like me who normally travels to the field, like, let's say 2 times a year, 2 weeks a trip to survey our operations and engage with the colleagues on the ground to see what's going on and how to better support and administer and provide oversight to their operations. And that is unfortunately gone. So that's all, my conversations with them are all virtual. And once, the pandemic ceases to be a pandemic, we will be able to travel more freely between locations. Then, to your point on I guess like more of the normative side of human rights rather than the operational and rather than the information gathering. I think there's a number of roads into that. There's perhaps, more academic positions doing research on human rights. There are, you could start with internships with the UN Human Rights Office in Geneva that works with the Human Rights Council, that works with the UN treaty bodies, which I haven't discussed, that I've not had much engagement with myself, but that manage the reporting on the UN human rights legal system of treaties, or obviously if you could get a position with one of those organizations as well. But I would say on the normative side, it's mostly the UN or academic institutions. There's also I don't want to call it a loophole, but a little like entry point where I think the most famous would be Philip Alston, but because he was a professor at a major research institution and because he was serving as a UN Special Rapporteur, he actually had posts available, research positions available through Columbia that were in the service of his position as Special Rapporteur. And I only know that one, but I'm sure there are more like that. So if you knew of someone who was serving in an advisory or expert position with the UN, but also has like other resources at their disposal, you could do research as attached to that person, to that human rights expert, which is not being UN staff, but it would be in support of their UN mandate, which is another thing worth exploring.
Mary, to follow up on that, what about NGOs? What are the options? What are the possibilities there, to your knowledge?
So on the normative framework, well, I will say that, of course, NGOs can always submit shadow reports to the UN treaty bodies. So they do their own research. From the US perspective, ACLU submits shadow reports, Human Rights Watch submits shadow reports. So they do their own research, but they are, I guess, less able to influence the normative UN framework and much more focused on advocacy to raise awareness over human rights issues and to try to move the UN, not to try the UN, as we know, what personality does it have, to try to move member states to move the needle within the UN. So I think that, but again, with NGOs, I think they would also look for more of a fieldwork foundation to your career before you start researching on a human rights issue with them.
Interesting perspective. Anybody else have anything to add to Mary's sense? I think that the idea of looking to NGOs for potential employment after SAIS is certainly something that I encounter a lot. A lot of students raise that question with me. And part of the reality, of course, is that NGOs don't pay anything. And, you know, if you've got a lot of school debt, you know, spending 2-3 years at an NGO may be a wonderful experience, but, you know, it may be very difficult.
I will say to that point, having graduated with $97,000 worth of debt,
Exactly.
I think, you know, fieldwork also, I mean, fieldwork is not a money-making venture by any stretch, but living in a very low income, low cost of living country makes your pittance of wages go a lot further. So there's that thing to consider. And then the other one that I would say between foundations, between NGOs and then the international organizations is, and I didn't even count US government or national government, there's that as well, and foreign service, but there are foundations. And foundations, I think, have a much more NGO slant type of work, but pay better than NGOs. So that, you know, I think of Ford Foundation, very active in human rights globally, Carnegie Endowment, not a foundation per se, but, you know, there's different ways to do research that are not, that fall between NGOs and international organizations.
Thank you. Does anyone have any experience with OSI by chance? Open Society?
I did very briefly upon graduating from SAIS. The Open Society was commissioning a bunch of papers written by SAIS students, which were going to be analyses on human rights and various issues. So I think it was about 20 of us, and I don't know if this is ongoing or not today with SAIS, but 20 of us were kind of drafted into drafting, sorry for that, all these various papers with various degrees of success. And I think eventually, because it was a rather long haul process, of the 20 of us, I think there's about 3 who finished the work for the 17 other ones who were called into work, you know, pre-existing work commitments. But the work was frankly absolutely fascinating. You know, and bouncing back on what both of you were saying, you know, the world of NGOs is very interesting, but as you said, really does not pay. But foundations, I think the OSI and the Ford Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, have that much more. I mean, first of all, pay much better, and that's, you know, not that life is necessarily going to be about pay, but when you have debts to pay in school and kids to feed, then it becomes an issue. But also they have more power than NGOs, right? I mean, what they produce, what they say reaches further in the debate than most NGOs. So in a way, it really is that middle point between NGOs and international organizations, both in terms of the content, as well in terms of the reach that it can have on policy or countries or the rest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. You know, one of the course offerings that the International Law Program has on the current agenda is a human rights law clinic, which is a student-driven, interactive, year-long experience. In fact, Kangsha is a member of that class right now, in which we study a particular human rights issue in a particular country, pre-selected. And since I took it over a couple of years ago, I've tried to make it much more law-focused, because we are, after all, an international law program and not an international journalism program. So it's not simply going there, writing, you know, observing abuses, writing a report, and recommending, you know, that the government stop abusing people. That's good work, but it's not legal work. So last year we studied the implementation of human rights law in the Republic of Georgia. And we went to Tbilisi, we spent a week there, we were focusing on issues of discrimination, police accountability, and media freedom. And we found that in all three areas, one of the most active voices, one of the loudest voices being heard and being welcomed was Open Society, which just so happened to have their field office next door to our hotel. So we were able to use their conference room for all of our meetings. We were assuming they weren't bugged. And, but we had terrific interactions with them, and they had access to the highest levels of the Georgian government. It was truly impressive. And they were making, you know, they were moderate, they were not partisan, but they latched onto issues and followed them, and I was quite impressed. And of course, we had two students in the class who before SAIS had worked for one of the Soros initiatives or another, and therefore we had instant contacts, and it worked fabulously well. So that is something certainly worth pursuing.
I will just add to that. I think that's a really good point. And I think, you know, there's also, it's worth doing your research on which organizations and foundations are active or promote programs in what part of the world. So indeed, OSI has a lot of programs in CIS and Eastern Europe, probably based on the background of the major backer of OSI. And I can't tell you, I have very little experience in the Americas, but I'm sure there are different foundations that are active there. So it would be worth students doing their research on that, because the right answer to that question could vary based on the part of the world.
And if I can add, sorry, and if I can, just one quick thing as well, beyond, you know, these foundations that we mentioned, there's an increasing amount of multinational corporations that are coming up with foundation-like activities, right? Researching various countries they're interacting with. And so have a component which is, you know, stepping beyond human rights, but has that developmental component to it, as well as that ability to interact like the Open Society initiative with all branches of government, because they represent the private sector. So that, you know, that would be another option to look into.
Indeed, and we are.
This is Lawrence.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add very quickly, just
Sure.
a thought on the notion of reaching out, being able to network and find. Once a year down here in South Florida, they put on this big crab feast at a seafood restaurant, and it's put on by Johns Hopkins, in Baltimore, the Homewood campus. The point is that when I go to this function, I'm the only SAIS grad there, and it says SAIS on my, and all of these Johns Hopkins alumni, they gravitate to me and they want to know what I studied and so on and so forth. And they have become a very, very good source of connections. And I'm sure for people who are in the ILAW program, to connect with the graduates of, you know, the mothership, as it were, up there in Baltimore, can be very, very helpful down the road, because those people invariably become, you know, very successful. So
that is a terrific idea. Thank you very much for that contribution. That's absolutely right, and certainly something I had never really focused on before, even though, of course, as we all know, the move that we are contemplating to 555 Pennsylvania Avenue in the next couple of years is being sponsored by a Johns Hopkins graduate who had nothing to do with SAIS.
Yeah, it's just that what I found in my own personal experience, and of course I'm far outside of the Beltway, is that the Johns Hopkins graduates from the Homewood campus are very, very impressed to meet someone who went to SAIS.
And many of them, of course, are business people. They're in the Foreign Service. They're all over. It's a big university with a worldwide reputation, and you should capitalize on that. I mean,
Yeah, I just want to throw it out.
every reason to do that. Well, that's a terrific idea. Of course, all of us are used to, I think all of us are used to, playing the sort of alumni card of our undergraduate institutions.
Sure.
And of the graduate institution itself, SAIS itself. But Lawrence's point, I think is really excellent and something that we should all.
And the crabs and beer are excellent as well.
Absolutely. Great idea. Yeah, so again, I think the point that Mary was making also, that if you are interested in, or even if you've concentrated in or minored in area studies in a particular part of the world, then that may in itself be an additional resume builder for someone looking for work in human rights or in related fields in that geographic area. So I know we have this year, for example, one of our ILAW minors is a Latin American studies concentrator, born in Latin America, bilingual, and on his way to law school, but he will be a very marketable, I think, in terms of pursuing a human rights career if that's what he ends up doing, and I think it probably will be. Well, we have just a couple of minutes left, so let me invite our speakers to wrap up before both Akansha and I thank them profusely for their attendance here this morning and for their contributions. And let me ask you, please, in your wrap-ups to address one question. I don't mean to embarrass anyone with this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Give us your au revoir, right? Your send-off, but also tell us, are you open to being contacted by SAIS students who might want to pursue, to get more information from you, to get more tips from you? Would you be willing to engage in those dialogues? So let me suggest that we do this in the reverse order from what we did before, and Qifan, you would then go first.
Sure. So to answer the question, yes, by all means, I personally benefited a lot from contacting previous SAIS alums when I was making the decision to go to law school. So if you have any questions on that, feel free to contact me, and I wish everyone at the ILAW concentration the best of luck.
Thanks. Mary?
Thanks. Thank you again for the opportunity to talk to you today. And I wish we were like in a room where I could see the students.
Yeah.
So of course I might not have been able to participate from this tiny little apartment if that is not in DC anyway. So thank you very much for the opportunity. There's one thing that I put in my notes that I wanted to say, which is not linked to my career or human rights specifically, but something that I think has helped me grow a lot, my network, is changing jobs fairly frequently. Now, I've worked within the same organization, but I think meeting new people along the way in your career is very valuable. And, you know, I mean, I'm not saying be irresponsible and leave a job 3 months in, but you know, spending 1 to 2 years somewhere and then saying I'm going to move and do something else is very helpful in broadening your network, and your network is very helpful in shepherding your career development along the way. So thanks for that, and feel free to reach out to me with advice. I will say as a caveat, because this always comes up, the UN is a large organization, so with a very cumbersome, well, it's a civil service with a very cumbersome hiring practice. So I'd be happy to provide you with advice, but please do not send me your resume in the hopes that I will be able to hire you off the bat. Unfortunately, and I wish we were different, but we are not, we do not hire in that manner. So, but happy to provide advice or, you know, thoughts on different career options as you wish. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Great, well, thank you very much. And you know, Mary reminds us, I think all of this reminds us of the expression that some of us toss around kind of jokingly about the SAIS mafia. You know, the SAIS mafia is everywhere. How many times have you heard that? The SAIS mafia is everywhere. Well, is it ever? Is it ever? I remember once being in the office of the Deputy Minister of Commerce of the government of Thailand in Bangkok, and there was a young woman working in the office who was tasked with greeting visitors, I guess, and introducing them to the Vice Minister. And we got chatting. She said, "Oh yes, I lived in the United States for a while. I was in Washington." "Well, what were you doing in Washington?" "I was at SAIS." So, I mean, this happens all the time. Mary mentioned the proceedings at Guantanamo and the human rights concerns that they raised. One of the leading advocates, one of the leading defense counsel for one of the four men who are potentially to be tried on capital charges, Alka Pradhan, is a SAIS alum. Indeed, she is a Jessup alum, and incidentally, Qifan, a Columbia Law School graduate. SAIS is the network that SAIS provides, the platform that it provides for contact should never be overlooked or ignored. It's really extensive and worth spending some time trying to learn about so that you can use it to your advantage. Lawrence, would you chime in?
I just have to tell a very quick story. While I was at SAIS, you know, I would go occasionally up to the career services, whatever center, gentleman Marty, I don't know if he's there anymore, but he would help me with you know, all of my grandiose ideas. And he had a picture on his desk, and it was of a billboard, a Coca-Cola billboard, and it was in Cyrillic, and it was advertising the 1000th anniversary of Manas. Well, I didn't even know what that was. And I asked him, where is that? He said, "Oh, that's in Kyrgyzstan. I went to Central Asia on a tour, you know, to try to bring in people from Central Asia." Anyhow, a few years later, I married a beautiful woman from Kyrgyzstan who I met in the very, very exotic location of Miami. So my advice is keep your eyes open. Don't preclude anything. You never know where the next opportunity will come from. And I don't regret a single second of my decision to come up there. I've made so many good friends and so many great connections. And, you know, I wouldn't even be on this call today if it weren't for making the connection with Professor Wiss and then, you know, leading so on and so forth. And everyone, please try to listen to our podcast, The American Question, on Pandora and Buzzsprout. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lawrence. And you know, everybody's got a story about the one lucky break, the one coincidence that's beyond imagining that made their successful careers possible. Everybody has them, and they all point to the same thing, which is that lucky breaks happen, and you just need to be able to spot them and take advantage of them, and don't overlook them. Don't overlook incidental connections that you might have with people. Mine came about because I had, as a college kid, you know, you put everything you can on your resume because when you're looking for a job, who knows what somebody might be interested in. And I put on my resume, just to fill space, that I had been the cox of an intramural crew at Yale as an undergraduate. Lo and behold, the person who interviewed me for a job that I thought I would never possibly get was an oarsman. He was a rower, and he was interested that I had coxed a crew, and one thing led to another, and if it weren't for that, I would not be present in this conversation right now. David?
Yeah, I think, you know, I mean, to your point, I think my one kind of big takeaway is that we should always be open to serendipity, right? Life is just a series of chance meetings, and life is incredibly long, and the world is very small. And so, you know, to the point, I would encourage everyone to get a SAIS water bottle and a SAIS pen, to flinging it out in every meeting, because you never know who's across from you, right? And that has been a great icebreaker for me. I mean, the number of times I ran into people and I whipped out my SAIS pen, and then someone said, "Oh, you went to SAIS, right?" And then one thing led to another. So this is, you know, the best $5 you're going to invest in getting that plastic pen from SAIS is absolutely worth it. But I think, you know, I might kind of takeaways from SAIS, and I'm not saying this because you hear it, but I think the Jessup Moot Court was, and I think as others have mentioned, fundamental in the education I got. And for those of you who are second year students, like, you know, that ship has sailed. But for those of you who are first year students, I you know, would really encourage you to look into it, because this has been, in many ways, you know, ticks a lot of boxes no matter what you end up doing. And then I think, you know, it comes back to what Mary was saying about different career paths, I think this is great advice. I think, you know, there's a lot of value also in doing what Mary did, which is evolving within the same organization, because that gives you an incredible amount of gravitas with the knowledge of that institution. So, like, you know, there's different ways about it, but no matter what, I think one should always be open to chance. Yeah, and a SAIS pen, sorry.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you all very much for attending. I'm going to hand the microphone back to Kansha to extend thanks on behalf of the students, but I think this has been very, very valuable, very helpful, I hope, to our audience, and profound thanks to all of you for staying in touch with SAIS.
Thank
Kansha, over to you.
all so much. That was a really great talk. A lot of the students were second years who attended, and honestly, this is great advice for us because we are going to be stepping out in 3 months, less than 3 months now, and all of this is going to come in really handy. Thank you for taking time out as well. I know everyone has been busy or is Zoom fatigued, but we really appreciate it. And in the future, if you have anything ILS can do for you, feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy, even if it's just connecting alums among themselves. We'd be happy to do that.
We will be putting out a program newsletter before too long. We were hoping we could have it out by today, but various glitches arose. But we'll be putting out a newsletter soon, and it'll be catching you up on developments at SAIS. And we hope that it will be interesting to you to see what the next generation, or perhaps 2 generations later, are actually doing while they're at the School of Advanced International Studies. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Hope you'll all stay in touch.
Great, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.